All right, so I'm very happy and excited. I'll just say it almost like it's formal, to be with dear comrades and friends Dimity and Tamatoa from Australia and from so-called Tahiti, in the Pacific. This is in some ways a continuing conversation of plenary we were on in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in November in IPRA. And I said I'm going to review a book called Peace, Decolonization, and the Practice of Solidarity, a recent book by Rob Skinner that focuses on two major events in Africa of the late 50s and 1960s, the Sahara Project campaigning against French nuclear testing in primarily Algeria and what was then Upper Volta, and then also Africa Freedom Action in East Africa in the 60s. But as little as those projects are known in both peace history and anti colonial histories, even more neglected and lesser known is the fact that the Sahara Project had the success after campaigning and grassroots organizing and cross-border international organizing and civil disobedience. The French did stop their nuclear testing in the Sahara in 1966. They did 6 years of testing from 60 to 66, and almost immediately, without skipping a beat, shifted the nuclear testing from Africa to the Pacific, from the Sahara to Tahiti, and that is never spoken about, and it was not really discussed by the movements, at least not in Africa or in the global North, amongst the supporters of the Sahara Project. And we're going to talk about it today, both in historical terms and contemporary terms, because if we're really going to talk about peace, decolonization, and the practice of solidarity, we have to understand that victories can be limited, and especially they're most limited if we don't have our eyes wide open and we're connected with one another. So yeah, I'll start off by saying, you know, you grew up, maybe your parents grew up or your grandparents grew up with nuclear testing in your country, Tamatoa. And I would be interested in hearing, and then Dimity, you can secondly, in the Pacific context of the whole region, talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in the face of nuclear testing and anti-nuclear movements that were building in your regions and in your areas.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Matt. I grew up actually by the time, I mean, I was born by the time the last bomb exploded on Fongatofa Atoll, and it was in 1996. So now we're in 2026, 30 years after the last bomb. I grew up without knowing much, knowing without knowing a lot on the topic, right? And particularly because it wasn't a part of our education, it wasn't a part of our family's discussions. Even if my grandparent, my granddad from my mom's side, worked on the nuclear side and died from a cancer in 1995, a year before I was born. So it was a bit touchy to talk about that in the family, but also growing up and, just finding your way as a young guy, a young person, and trying to understand the world or the environment that you're living in. But on the second hand, my parents, yeah, you were right that my parents grew up in the 60s, they were born in the 60s. So when the nuclear testing program started, and it was, I think there's a lot of, these changing of the society that my parents went through, the process of being assimilated to the new society, to the French society, was a bit challenging, but there's a bit of trauma inside within that we are not really talking about. So it's kind of you know, touchy, traumatized topic in the society and still, but happy, I'll say that now we are talking more about it and we are doing a lot of activities to raise awareness, at least, and then to avoid ignorance, I'll say.
Dimity, you're a little bit older, maybe a couple of years older, and
Just
have
one, just
the regional context of being based in Australia. What are your recollections and thoughts about seeing the development of movements and yeah, anti-nuclear movements?
yeah, I was just listening and thinking, Tamatoa, I'm the generation before you, at least, I guess. I was born in 69, so, I'm old. I'm getting old now. Um, Born here in Australia, as a little kid, oblivious to all of these things, came to Fiji when I was 5, 6 years old. Initially, came back to Fiji again, spending my sort of early childhood and into my teens, early teens. Then moved to Aotearoa, then to Papua New Guinea, and then back to Australia. So my childhood, my growing up was very much a Pacific childhood in a sense. And in that time, and 1970s in Fiji in particular, um, in that time, the talk around nuclear was huge. I, in fact, have just completed my PhD looking at the early anti-nuclear movement because of the influence that it had on my life. So I looked at 1966 to 1974, which was just before I arrived in Fiji, but this time of the budding anti-nuclear movement that we saw in Fiji. So it was very much there. It was very much during my childhood, an undercurrent. I come from a family that had a lot of military people who fought. My grandparents both fought in the war. My step grandfather, all of these sorts of people had fought in the war. The war here for Australians was very much initially in Europe, but then became very much a Pacific campaign. And I had a great uncle who was in Changi prison, and there was many atrocities that happened in the war, as war does. But there was a great deal of conflict with the way that generation saw the acts of Japan. And then when I became a peace activist, when I was sort of emerging into my peace activism, anti-militarism, anti-nuclearism in my early 20s, there was a lot of conflict within my family too about why I would be speaking out, against these things. And it's been an emerging thing for me, to find a way through the silences that war and conflict has brought upon us, the silences that have been imposed on us through colonialism and through complacency and complicity in greater foreign forces having control over our lands and so forth. Finding ways to sort of reconcile what people would rather not talk about, which is nuclearization and so forth. So here in Australia, of course, there was British nuclear testing. Before that, there was the American testing, and we are very much aligned with America here in Australia. We have US bases here that target and are used in targeting of nuclear warfighting. We have an enormous amount of uranium here, about a third of the world's recoverable uranium. All of these links have been a part of what has made me an activist. And very much influenced by growing up in a time of nuclear weapons testing. And that went on right through my childhood, right into my early 20s, into my 20s, actually, almost towards my 30s, where there were massive movements throughout the region, massive movements, massive protest movements sustained throughout the region against nuclear weapons testing by France in Tahiti, in Mohenui. So it's been absolutely essential to my entire life, my entire activism, this whole story.
Yes, I'd love to hear a little bit from you, but also from either of you. It seems to me as we shift through the last half century of struggle globally, there is a particular thing. Maybe I don't want to idealize, but the Pacific has been a place where this idea of nuclear free and independent, these decolonizing and peace links, have been more maybe not seamlessly, but more consistently connected than in other parts of the world. And I'd love to hear your commentary as we, this will be the last question before we get to now and tomorrow, but a little more just about that history of looking at peace and decolonization, looking at nuclear free and independent in that interconnected way, and why you think that is, and how you think that's made things different.
Can I
Tamatoa,
go
you want
first?
to?
Okay,
You go
okay.
first.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that because when it comes to the advocacy, the activism on nuclear, the nuclear testing program, and even here in French Polynesia during 1966 and 1996, when France decided on doing the nuclear testing program, there were a lot of protests as well. And I think we need to emphasize on that because it wasn't like only, considering us as subject, but also people from the communities to stand up and to raise their voices so as to find justice. And the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement has a huge and important place into that advocacy on the islands, because I also remember that one of the NFIP meeting was here in Tahiti in 1995, if I'm not wrong. And it was handled, by the diverse and different NGOs from the islands, but also the support from the Pacific. And thanks to that collaboration, to that partnership, it was pretty clear that if we want to stop those testing, with independence can be the answer. And how do we make sure that this can be, one of the aims that the NGOs, can explore? And one of the political party and the current pro-independent political party at the government was the first and unique political movement here on the island to, protest against nuclear testing, but also for independence. So I think when it comes to the NFIP, let's say, presence in the Pacific, it helps it has helped a lot the different communities all around the islands, and it's something that can and needs to be revived. And there's so many collaborations right now happening, so we can talk later about that. But I think that movement started and need to be acknowledged.
Absolutely, it does. It was a vital movement. You ask, Matt, how it became so linked to independence and decolonization. And the answer, I think, was summed up beautifully in an interview I did for my thesis with Taufa Vakatale, who was the former deputy prime minister of Fiji. She also was an amazing activist, long-term anti-nuclear activist, really an inspiring human being who we lost just a couple of years ago. Taufa Vakatale just said simply, nuclear testing was colonialism. It was entirely linked. It wasn't possible for the nuclear testing to be happening here in this country without colonialism, or indeed anywhere without colonialism. So for here in Australia, you know, this significant movement, the significant nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement, began in, you know, in the region in the 1960s, but it was sort of built off a deeper history, because already there had been nuclear weapons testing in our region by the United States and by Britain as well. One of the things that when I started doing my thesis, I was kind of racking my brain, you know, because I grew up with this sort of conversation around alliances and our you know, the Cold War. I grew up in the Cold War, you know, as a child of the Cold War, as yourself, Matt, you know, and as a child in the Cold War, we grew up with this idea that there was dangers from, you know, other places and da, da, da. There were dangers, and we should all be worried about the nuclear weapons of Russia, for example, the Soviet Union. We should all be worried about they're coming for us, all of these sorts of dialogues that were happening. You know, we saw people doing duck and cover exercises over in America, duck and cover, blah, blah, blah. There was all of this, you know, fear and worry about, you know, there will be a nuclear strike on a big city somewhere. Meanwhile, for us, the reality was here in our countries, in our region, on our islands, in our deserts, they were testing these weapons. They were using them, and they weren't the big enemies. These were supposed to be our friends. So over a 50-year period, there were 315 nuclear weapons tests in this region. The largest ever nuclear weapons tests by these three countries were done in our region, on our islands, on our deserts, in our oceans, in our atmosphere, on our bodies. You know, it was colonization. It is still colonization. And it's a massive effort that still is ongoing and unfolding to decolonize our own minds in this nuclear colonization that has happened, and really to define, identify, interrogate, and resist nuclear colonialism, because it's still very prevalent for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't think of a better segue to the current day by reiterating that as a period now where we're looking at the headlines, you know, press us to look at intensified colonialism and colonial genocide in places like Palestine, but also Congo and Sudan and other places. But the fact is, this moment of recolonization and remilitarization for much of the world and neocolonialism, for some people also just means a continuation of the same old, same old. So, you know, we had in Ottawa at the IPRA conference, these occupied peoples forum, these people from Palestine, Puerto Rico, West Papua, of course, where the struggle for independence has been a steady stream, never having achieved independence, and in Africa, Western Sahara, Amazonia, etc. But you know, more locally here, you know, we can't. I can't hear you say these things. I can't think about them without thinking about our own U.S.'s own colony of Puerto Rico, where, amongst many other things, economic and political, the island of Vieques, of course, was used in the same period of time as the bombing range. It's a populated island, but as the bombing range for testing everything that the US threw everywhere else. You know, this last April was the 50th anniversary of the reunification of Vietnam, the end of the Vietnam War, when the Vietnamese successfully won and victoriously kicked out the US. And a Viequenza, an elder Viequenza activist, was with me and some others on a delegation to Vietnam for the 50th anniversary, and meeting with some people who were survivors of napalm and other U.S. atrocities in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. You know, the connection was you know, it was tenable. It was in the bones. You know, the napalm that destroyed so many of your lives and continue to have birth defects, etc., was tested on my island with my own, family and friends who died of cancer, etc., like your granddad, Tamatoa. So the struggle continues. Also at IPRA, I had the pleasure of moderating a panel where the two of you and our dear sister Emily Welty spoke about International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, the Nobel Peace Organization that the two of you and she and many others have helped build. And we talked about a little bit you talked about what it meant to win a big prize when the work is continuing, when it's ongoing. And so really the two of you and Emily and Matthew and others have a lot of time with this nuclear truth project. We think about truth and reconciliation in lots of places, but for you all, you talk about it in terms of nuclear peace. So I want to hear from you about the current work and about how that work seeks to work for peace and decolonization, but in very particular ways in each of your communities and societies. So please share.
That's a great question. I think sometimes, I mean, we already have been talking about that, but like, I feel like when it comes to the nuclear truth project and the nuclear truth protocols, the importance of respecting the people testimonies, but respecting people themselves impacted, affected by the nuclear explosions or the context of the nuclear testing program. And I feel like I'm happy because we are doing a lot of collaboration with Dimity and all the allies around the world on the, nuclear protocols, ethics protocols. And something that I'm also want to mention is that after the 3 decades of the nuclear testing program, we are dealing with people affected by trauma or traumatized by that period, or not really easy to share their testimonies, their experiences, their realities. But it's also a period where, as Dimity mentioned, as nuclear testing, from her interview, nuclear testing is colonialism. And as in the context right now, there's so many scientists interested into knowing about our own consequences as affected communities. At some points, we need to respect or to put some borders. Or if we want to be respectful, we can also put some protocols or rituals, right? In our culture, we talk about rituals, protocols, and so on. And that's also the aim of the nuclear ethics protocols. It's like, how do we make sure that our people are respected when it comes to their realities, to their experiences? And how do we make sure that there's reciprocity? Do we make sure that we respect their rights? I mean, those are the 3 main points of the nuclear ethics protocols that Dimity can share more about after. But I feel like if there's, this question of how do we find peace or how do we live peacefully now in our society, it's an ongoing question, but also an ongoing request from the affected communities, and to make sure that they're not only protected, respected, but that they can live longer. And this is the challenge, but this is also the point when it comes to safety. If we want to be safe, it's also a way of how do we find peace by being safe. And this is something that we can easily find in the indigenous language. If we want to talk about safety, we talk about peace, and so on. So I feel like those points are important to be reconsidered and to put to the table, to bring to the table right now, around all the academic political discussions happening in our communities, but also around the world.
Tom, so
I would
you were
just say.
saying that when you talk about peace in your language, there is no separate word for security, or safety. Say
No, because
something.
there's no word to talk about safety in our own language. If we want to talk about safety, we talk about peace. There's no accurate word to translate safety or security in our language except peace. Peace is the language. Peace is the security, the translation of security or safety. As far as I know.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you.
It's such a beautiful linkage to safety and peace, because they can be quite separate in the English language. You know, we can really separate those things out. But should we? Because isn't it always linked to peace? Like, shouldn't it always be linked to peace? I'm a little lost, Matt. Sorry. I'm so caught up in what Tamatoa says, as always, that I've lost my thread a little bit with my own thinking. Can you just repeat the question again for me?
No, and it was pretty broad and open. I went from questions of recolonization and remilitarism to questions of, hey, tell us about what you're doing with the Nuclear Truth Project. So and everything in between. So it was easy to get lost. Yeah.
Well, the Nuclear Truth Project, is a project of great joy and sometimes great sorrow. These things can be linked. It is a project that arose after the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And it arose really out of big conversations that we were having with a lot of people around the world about truth and reconciliation, and some people saying, well, is it time now that we've got this treaty to be talking about a truth and reconciliation process? And myself and quite a number of other people, including Matt, as you mentioned before, and Emily and others, were like, oh, we are nowhere near that. No, we are nowhere near that right now. We have a long way to go before we are in that sort of space. And I have been working over my lifetime of activism with communities here in Australia, and very concerned for the communities throughout the Pacific because of my upbringing in the Pacific as well, and really concerned at finding a way to amplify and rely on the voices of survivors, who are the ones who make all the difference. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons would never have come about had it not been for the voices of survivors. And so there was, there's a real recognition of that, but at the same time, a real exploitation and an additional burden was being placed on affected community members. Because as the world was waking up to Articles 6 and 7 in this treaty, which are the articles concerned with victim assistance and environmental remediation, people were saying, okay, we've got to look at how we deal with these things. We've got to look at victim assistance. We've got to look at environmental remediation. Let's go into those communities, make more inquiries. That became its own burden into affected communities. And it was placing an enormous amount of strain on communities, which Tamatoa has spoken about previously, that are already overburdened, that are already dealing with just getting through life. There are so many problems in so many communities that are just struggling to get by. So many huge economic, cultural, colonial pressures that are taking far more priority than talking about these things. And not really any great solutions. There's so many cases I could cite about where harms were done and never even monitored. So how do people, now people are turning up and knocking on the door and saying, tell us about your experience or your intergenerational health impacts, or how many miscarriages happened in your families, or all of these sorts of questions that people are sort of drawing on their own experience. And yet there's, at the same time, it's like, prove it, prove it, prove it, without really understanding the pressures this is placing on people, really understanding the expectation that if you come to us asking for our story, that what are you giving us back in terms of what peace will you help us find? What justice will you help us find for this? Don't just come and take our stories. Don't just come and be extractive, because that's colonialism again, and it's exhausting us again. So this was very much part of my personal motivation, and the motivation of quite a number of people. We came together. One of the first things that we did in many long conversations with people throughout 2021, as the world was locked down and still in COVID restrictions in many, many places, including here, we were having many long conversations over Zoom with people, and bringing together, seeking out people and saying, would you come and have a conversation with us? Let's start talking together. In that process, one of the first things that was identified was that there was a need for protocols. And that conversation began with the affected community members. And a couple of us, myself included, were invited into those conversations to help, gather and bring together this idea of protocols. How do we set up protocols which will help people who are coming into communities understand the expectations? But also, how do we help communities understand that they have these rights? They have the right to be respected. They have the right to expect reciprocity in the ways that if they're having their stories taken, how does this come back to people? So that's where it began. We began with protocols. We did a large process with the protocols. It took 8 months of very intense meetings with a small group, which people came and went and came and went, and we put together a first draft, and we launched those protocols at the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW in 2022. And after that, we launched a process, a year-long process of review of those, and we went into 3 regions to ask for feedback about the protocols. And from that, we sort of refined them more, because it's big thinking stuff to begin with, and then you sort of hone it down and hone it down. And even now, it's still very long. But if you look at the protocols as they are, they're not a checklist. They're not a guideline. They are a very broad set of indications from affected communities of what may be expected. And it changes, because although there is a commonality of experience for people who have been exposed to nuclear weapons use and testing, there is not the same across all cultures, of course. The ways that we translate, interpret, adapt the protocols are different in different cultures. And that's really key. Tamatoa has been one of the key people involved in translating in Tahiti. And he can tell you more about how complex that process was for that context. It's not a Google Translate sort of situation. This is really a deep, meaningful, translation of an adaptation to the cultural relevancy of a different place. So that was one of the first things that we did with the Nuclear Truth Project. We've also been working a lot around challenging nuclear secrecy, because when we talk about victim assistance and environmental remediation, one of the biggest things that we have, one of the biggest challenges we have as communities who've been impacted by nuclear weapons testing and use, is actually finding out what happened. The information still lies under, decades long military and security, national security secrecy and lockdown, and the records are hidden or dispersed in different places, are really hard to access, are privileged in their access. So we put together a report about that in 2023 and relaunched it again last year with a little bit of an update. And then the third thing that we do, and which is the thing that I get untold amounts of joy from, is the community connections. Really, it's about the connections with people, bringing people together, yes, online like we do here, but, in those wonderful moments where we can, to be together in a room like we were in Aotearoa. It was such a privilege to have you, Tamatoa, come over and join with us. It's always been such a privilege to be together at these meetings at the UN. We have tried to listen deeply when people have talked about the ways that those UN processes have been very alienating and can be very difficult to navigate, I've heard from affected community members who say, I feel like my bones have been picked dry by the end of a week at the United Nations. Everyone wants a piece of me. Everyone wants to take these stories and wants a piece of me. And so, last year with the meeting of states parties, we ran community hubs, which were for affected community members, and we had breakfasts and lunches over a couple of days, and we had sessions that were run by affected community members who wanted to tell their story in their way, in their voice, in their time. And it was a really beautiful and I think powerful bringing together, but also just, I think, when we talk about the question of safe and peace, for us, it was about creating space so that people could feel safe and find peace together and find the space together to talk and find those commonalities. And that community connection work for me is one of the favorite parts of the work. So right now we're working towards this new project, which is a Reclaim Fellowship, and Tamatoa is one of our advisors on this new project, and we're going to be meeting later today, which I'm very excited about. We've got 6 young fellows, who, not necessarily all that young, 6 fellows who are joining us from 3 different areas, 2 from Mohenui, 2 from Marshall Islands, and 2 from Kazakhstan, who are going to be working with us over this year. We're going to be doing monthly sessions with them, talking about all different aspects of the nuclear story, bringing in experts from different fields in what we hope will be a very reciprocal, my words have gone, reciprocal learning process where people come in and teach maybe about the science of nuclear, the medicine of nuclear, but we also expect them to listen to the lived experience expertise of those fellows in our rooms as well, and hear about their contributions that can be made through this process as well. So these are the ways that we're working in the Nuclear Truth Project. And yeah, it's exciting. And it's an honor to be doing that work at the moment, especially with people like Tamatoa and our vast community in this world who are, just inspiring and incredible and resilient and heartfelt.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always for me, coming from the US at this particular moment, it feels like a tremendous privilege. We have lots of privileges, my gender, my alleged ethnicity, my class, there's lots of privileges, but I do always say the greatest privilege of my life has been joining the peace and justice movements and getting to have hope, because I meet and hear of the work of people like you, and not just people like you, but you and you and you. And so, yeah, thank you. I guess I want to give each of you a chance to have final comments, because I want to avoid the temptation of talking to you for hours and hours and hours and hours, which I would like to do. I think my favorite thing in life is to not be a professor, but to be a student, and to just sit there and say, tell me more, tell me more. but I don't want to be one of those UN NGOs or UN states who's like just sucks out every bit of your energy. So let's have a final round of any closing comments that you make. I guess I will just say one thing for my closing comments, for my final. It does seem to me, as I hear both of you talk about current work and Nuclear Truth Project and connecting these dots amongst peace, decolonization, and solidarity, and what solidarity has to mean in the 21st century, is that it's not primarily a case. Yeah, I am intrigued. We could do an entire session just on some of these translation and transliterational issues. Dimity, you talked about, some of Tamatoa's challenges in translating some of the work. But really, especially as we look at indigenous cultures and we look at some of our environmental comrades from all parts of the world, and we're not rejecting modernity per se, but we're looking at indigenous wisdoms that have carried on for centuries, despite uh, the onslaught of capitalism and industrialization, etc., in a way that actually values land and peoples and the environment around us, and not to fetishize or simplify. But I think it's most surely not about translating some texts from the global north, figuring out how these words that don't quite fit nonviolence, I don't even know what they mean, but it's really about coming up with a new language, all of us, a new language of struggle and sustainability and sustenance. And so thank you both, I'll say, for before you give your final remarks, for helping to give us some new portals into new languages and new methodologies of being together. Now, your final remarks.
I'll go first. Thank you so much, Matt and Dimity. It's so inspiring to share the platform, the space with you both, and to all other friends that we're working together. My final remarks will be how important is to uh, be or to have solidarity, but how important is to work together because it opens the mind, it opens new gates, and it opens so many things that we couldn't even think. We know that we have a lot of things to do in our own ways and stuffs in the academy or in the communities and so on, but working together or finding a space, a world where we can live and be together uh, makes really the difference. And I'm grateful because even through our discussions, it helps to have new ideas or to think about thoughts that we wouldn't even have thought before, right? So yeah, I'm grateful about this time. I'm grateful about that opportunity to collaborate and to be in the same space as you and as other friends. Thank you so much.
As always, beautifully said, Tamatoa. Yeah, I'm deeply grateful to be with you both and to think out loud together and to share thoughts with you. It is about that. It is all about the connections. It's all about those finding those ways of coming together, recognizing the different things that we bring. And, Tamatoa, you speak so beautifully of the Indigenous ways of knowing these things and how important that is for us to understand intergenerationally, from different parts of the world. And yet we're talking in the same thread, the same thread of violent nuclear violence or militaristic violence. And yet underlying all of this is the beauty of the hope that we find together, the beauty of the moment where we find connection because there is a better way, and that humans are always striving actually to find ways to be in peace with one another. I believe the vast majority of us do. The vast majority of us aren't spitting at our neighbors and stuff. We're not, deliberately going out there. There are outliers who go out there and are violent and terrible. And, we're seeing a lot of that right now. But they are the outliers. They're not the majority of the world. The majority of the world want to live in peace and find connection. So I do believe that. Sometimes I'm called naive. So I think that these moments where we can come together and find story, and I love that we found that through a perhaps unsatisfied book review for you, Matt. That's where it began for you. I think that's a really interesting thing. I did want to just, on that book review, I did want to say just one thing, which is the Algeria story, which is such an important story, such a vital story, and we don't talk about it enough in the Pacific, I think, either. I don't think we make those links enough, and I think we should. But also, even while they were at war, even while that struggle to get rid of the French was happening in Algeria, the French were building in Tahiti. They were building their experimental setup. They were doing that from the early 1960s. So although they only turned to the Pacific in 1966, they already had their intentions outlined. They were already putting the concrete down, right, Tamatoa? And I think that it's important to remember that was always their intention to come here, and they maintain it now. They've just changing. There's some debate about changing the ways that they compensate victims of the nuclear violence that they perpetrated in Tahiti, reducing down the definition of who is a victim and what years they recognize as being impacted by nuclear weapons testing. There's a lot of ways in which this is still unfolding. So the importance of solidarity and being in touch with one another and telling these stories and making these connections and drawing the lines between the dots is so important. And I really thank you, Matt, for inviting us into a conversation that's so precious in this time.
No, thank you. Thank you both. I should say I'm not going to, I'm sorry, Tamatoa, did you want to add? No. I should say I'm not going to give a bad book review. And I think it's a valiant effort. And the title, the most breathtaking of all. I do just feel like there was an opportunity here, and these are opportunities we need to take to go deeper. Yes, based on their power and their money and their sort of limited view of what is needed in the world, i.e., their own ability to line their pockets. They always have a plan B and C and D. And we need to be better at having plans B and C. If we win a victory here, we don't let them mess up someone else's world over there, and we do that by being together. And so sharing your togethers and your time is so beautiful and wonderful. So thank you, and lots of love and solidarity always.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you so much, Matt.